About myself. Hello, my name is Eric Ford. I am a professor in the School of Public Health as well as a joint appointment in the School of Business and Management. And I came here about 2 years ago. Prior to this, I was a professor at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, in the School of Public Health. And there I ran their management programs, which included the MHA, the MBA, MHA, several doctoral programs, altogether about 20 different executive and other endeavors, certificates and the like, and about 1,000 enrollees. So actually the programs I ran at Johns Hopkins were bigger than many of the other programs here. All right. So if you have any questions about me, please don't be bashful to ask. Oh, excuse me. And I do have the chat on, so I can see the chat here. I guess you all can see the chat as well. By way of introductory lecture, I'd like to go into a little bit of what makes management different from leadership, because I think this is something that interests all of you, as well as talk a little bit about the philosophy of the class. I've departed from what the business school and the School of Public Health normally do by way of assessment. They have a philosophy that I can give you a standardized test, assess that you've learned the material I've put forward, and then you can move on. I personally don't see a great deal of value in that. To that end, I have tried to create assignments that will create tools that you can use into your current professional lives, as well as in your future lives, and not just have a memory of some exam you took 5 or 6 years ago. So we're going to do a lot of things about developing your personal management style, put together a personal board so that you're getting good advice. And I would tell you the most challenging feature all of us face in our professional lives is managing upward. In other words, getting our bosses to do the right thing, to focus on the things that matter, etc. And I'll just tell you anecdotally from my own experience here at UAB in the past year, during COVID, it's been very difficult to get the upper leadership to focus on things other than money. What are our values? What do we owe to the larger Birmingham and Alabama communities? We are a state school after all. And I think on occasion they've lost sight of those things, in part because they're not well connected to the faculty, the students, and to some extent the community. And that's a little harsh. In some ways, they're better connected to the community when I talk about our academic leadership than they are even their own faculty or students. So it's been a little bit tricky, but I would say we've not been at our best here at UAB. And with that said, that's not a criticism per se. When you give people bad choices, they make bad decisions, and it's to be expected. So that's where we are in the world. But this brings us down to the question of what is the difference between management and leadership? And this is a big question and not a trivial question. I would tell you for myself personally, I am a fairly good manager. In other words, I set up good systems that people thrive in. I'm less of a leader. I'm not interested in doing a lot of the transformational things that people need. I'm typically more of a fixer, and most of the places I've worked, either as a hospital executive or as a faculty member, I've been a fixer. So a couple things about the classes. For the MBA students who are listening, I've put up some of the lectures that come from my good friend and mentor. He was actually my dissertation chair, Jack Duncan, and he's really the world's leading authority on management. And so I've put his lectures up, and I will augment those both with my own lectures that focus on healthcare for those of you who have an interest in healthcare, and I know that's not everybody. And I'll also put up general lectures that accompany each of the modules as well, including this one today. So for your information, this is in fact being recorded. Please, act accordingly. So let's talk about leadership versus management. What is it? What does it really mean? Why is it important? And what are some of the things we've learned along the way? If you have questions or thoughts or experiences you'd like to share, I do have the chat open and I'm sort of looking, and my graduate assistant, Kunal Patel, is following along, and he'll be sure to, Kunal, if I'm missing something terrible, my phone's here, text me. Let me know what's going on. One of the things I want to do is debunk some of the myths. I want to challenge some of your preconceptions. I think a lot of what people think about leadership and management is just fundamentally wrong all the way around. And this is as good of time as any for you to start to think more broadly as well as differently about what really goes on. So the first question is, do we even need leadership? And I would tell you, we're in a changing society. My parents were fairly conformist, and they were taught to be conformist. They followed direction. When they were told something was for the greater good, they accepted that argument. They didn't need great deals of rationale from the leadership above them to do the things they did. With that said, many people today, whether they be Gen Xers, which is the group born from 1965 to the mid 1970s, whether they be millennials or onward, a lot of times those groups have more interest in what is the underlying principles about what we're doing that matters. And that's where leadership often comes in. Most of management and leadership draws initially from the military tradition. And a matter of fact, we've seen the militarization of the workplace throughout our history. There's two words, line and staff. To be an officer of the line in the United States Navy, I was a member of the Navy for several years, meant that you worked on a ship and that you were going into battle potentially. If you were a member of the staff, that typically meant that you were on shore, that you managed logistics, that you kept us supplied, and those sorts of things. Traditionally, line officers were more important than staff officers, but over time that gradually changed. In particular, by the end of World War II, the chief of staff was by far the single most important person in the United States military. I might ask you, do you know who was the chief of staff of the US military at the end of World War II? He's fairly famous for a variety of reasons, because after World War II, he initiated a plan to rebuild Europe, and that plan was called the Marshall Plan, and he was General Marshall, and he was the supreme Allied commander, and that includes Eisenhower worked for Marshall, Nimitz worked for Marshall. All of the people you typically hear about as being great generals, admirals, leaders, MacArthur, for example, they all worked for Marshall, and he was the chief of staff and worked directly for the president. And a lot of this began in ancient history, and you can go back to Alexander and before, and the way they organized their armies. And there's lots of work, particularly around Julius Caesar, who was both a great politician, a great manager, and a great leader. And he was one who said the Romans won more battles with the pick than the sword, meaning that they tended to get to the battlefield first. They picked where the fight was going to happen. They massaged the terrain to their advantage, and they were ready when the enemy got there to win the battle. And that idea of a military approach to management and leadership has persisted to this day, to be candid. Oh, excuse me. So, what is the importance of leadership? Leaders are the keepers of the vision. They're the people who set out a clear statement of what we are and what we do. It's very simple. If you look at the Amazon logo, there is an A, and underneath it is an arrow that points to Z, and it forms a smiling face. But Amazon's goal was to deliver to you everything from A to Z. Think about that. That's a fairly powerful statement. And it's also fairly clear that we are going to be the people who send you everything you could possibly want. And to that end, he's done a lot of those things. Jeff Bezos is who I'm referring to. Uh, Interestingly, if you look at your Amazon Prime on the TV screen, it goes from I to D, which is your id, which I don't know if that makes any sense, but there's a joke in there somewhere. Um, Managing is also important, though. Getting things right is what managers do. Poor leadership costs millions, in particular in the form of stress. And for those of you who are in healthcare these days, you know that stress is one of the highest forms of problems we're dealing with: stress, burnout, and turnover. In the UAB health system, every time a nurse quits, it costs over $40,000 to replace him or her, her or him, get the order right. That's huge. And oh, by the way, that's just the dollar cost of replacing the individual. That is not the cost of the stress that is then induced on the other coworkers, the reduction in the quality of care, the poor outcomes that followed on. So what we've seen over the past few years is an increased focus on leadership development and corporate performance assessment of leaders from their peers. And you can see this in something called 360-degree reviews, where the subordinates are giving the leaders feedback and those sort of things. So there is a direct relationship between leadership, motivation, stress, and performance. This is just absolutely true. This is one of the few things that the research has proven with absolute certainty. So what are the three variables we use to assess performance? Well, the first one is ability, and this is hiring. Hiring the right people is absolutely essential. Also, training those people, giving them the opportunity for learning experiences to increase their ability and competence. The second part is motivation. Do they really want to do this? Do they believe what they do matters? And this is often hard for some employees who are in the front line. If you're the person that's cleaning up in a health system, doing the janitorial or other work, it's often difficult to see that what you do is actually influencing the outcomes that our patients have. Although, I will say this, in light of what's been going on with COVID and other things, it's come to the forefront the importance of those people in the maintenance, sanitation, and other line divisions to help us in what's happening. And I think they're actually sort of getting the love they've long deserved. And that's good. That increases their motivation. And resources, making sure that people actually have the tools they need to do the job they do. I'm often amazed that we starve people for resources when they need things to get their job done. It's just absolutely insane. When I was a hospital administrator and used to do the weekend shift, I went up to a floor and the nurses were struggling because the copy machine was broken and they couldn't do the things they needed to do to place orders for medicine and other things. And I went down to the administrative offices. I unplugged our copier, pushed it into the elevator, and took it up there. And the next Monday, I was summarily abused by my own manager, but I didn't care because I knew I'd done the right thing and I'd actually made those nurses' lives better. And it all wound up working out in the end. But resources matter. And so here's how people typically perform. And this is a function of competence, motivation, how much time you give people to do things. And this is sort of how you'll, one way to think about it. And I'm not going to belabor this slide. So leadership is often about the personal interaction. How do I get people to do things that they might not otherwise do of their own volition? Again, back to the military. Who wants to go fight to the death? Nobody. Nobody in their right mind wants to do that. And that's why we often talk about what is it that makes people have Elan? Is it some love of country, some idea of a greater purpose, that there's some great reward at the end of it all? That's what leaders bring to the table. So, what is the biggest cause of stress and burnout in the workplace today? Most people say it's their immediate supervisor. And this takes on many forms. I'll tell you, my immediate supervisor tends not to show up for work very much. Lots of the things around the office that need to be attended to on a day to day basis simply aren't. The staff members who are supposed to be in place to do vital functions and getting work done are absent or on vacation and their jobs haven't been filled. And those are the sorts of things that cause me stress. And I can attribute almost all of those to my immediate supervisor. If you're not a good boss, and whether that's being a manager or a leader, chances are you're causing your people stress. Also, people who have highly controlling styles are largely out of fashion these days. It's no longer possible to micromanage people. This happens for a variety of reasons. Organizational structures have become much more flat, meaning there's much less middle management. You couldn't possibly micromanage people even if you wanted to, you'd simply run out of time. So when you try to do it, you stress not only them, but yourself. One of the big things that emerged in leadership and management in the past few years are what we call climate studies. And climate is slightly different than culture. Climate is the cross sectional or the snapshot of what's going on in an organization. Culture is the longitudinal or the long term look at what's happening. So these climate studies were often done using one time surveys, as you've probably experienced in your own workplace. And what do people complain about? Well, they say they have unclear roles and responsibilities. They aren't given the authority to do the job the way they think would be done best, and they don't have support from their peers. Another big takeaway, and this isn't, and much of the management research, and I'm a management researcher, is controversial at best. One thing that is not controversial is stress is infectious. You think COVID 19 spreads, stress spreads. And actually, we've seen it with COVID, is the stress that this disease has caused has spread even more than the disease itself in many ways. So we leak stress onto others. If your coworker is unhappy, it's very difficult to be happy in your own life. Stress has both financial and moral imperatives. I talked to you earlier about how the nurses cost $40,000. It's just horrible. And when a nurse leaves, he or she tends to do it on short notice, leaving the other nurses on a floor unsupported. And it's just a moral imperative to reduce these at all times. So, what's the holy grail of all this? What makes a good leader? In the 1930s and 50s, the great man approach. And you notice I italicized man here because it was particularly focused on men. And often we thought people were born to it. You know, there was still an aristocracy about the whole thing. And to this day, there's still something to that. They occasionally do studies where they will show German school children pictures of two US candidates for a elected position. For example, they'll show them a picture of Bill Clinton and George Bush, and Bill Clinton will win with the German school age children. Why? He's the better looking man, apparently. And so there is something to this. I don't know what to say about it. We know that people who are taller tend to get elected more often, tend to get promoted more often, tend to get paid more. People who are better looking tend to get paid more, tend to get promoted more often. There is this trait approach that is not without some merit in our society. And it continues on. In the 1960s, however, the research switched to largely a behavioral approach. And I left it, by the way, in the English spelling, because this was largely done in England, these sorts of studies. In the 1970s, we moved to something called the situational or contingency approach. And a lot of this was the work of a man named Henry Mintzberg, and very influential work. There was also something called the managerial grid. But this talked about having the right person in the right situation. I would tell you, I know something about myself, not a lot, not as much as I might ought to at this point in life, but I'm one of those people who tends to get better as things get worse. I sort of calm down and sort of pause for a moment and look around and say, oh, let's just take a moment and regroup here. And so I've been typically fairly good in crisis, where I'm not as good as in the day-to-day stuff. And these are the sorts of things, as you do your assignments over the course of this term, I hope you think about how you behave under different situational or contingency approaches. And this stuff is very powerful. The stuff from the 1970s in particular tends to hold up better. And I would tell you some of the things that we did in the 80s, 90s, and onward have been less appealing. In particular, one of my least favorite things in the leadership world is something called authentic leadership. So when you hear that in the future and people advocate for authentic leadership, take pause. So in the 1960s, as I mentioned, we talked about these behavioral things, and a lot of it wound up saying that a participatory organizational format was the optimal. In other words, you weren't autocratic, but you did give people input, and not just input. When I say participative versus consultative, they actually had some say that managed to stick. All right. All right. And I'll skip over that. So what are the new paradigms of leadership? And you'll see the 70s and you think, gee, he's going almost 40 years, 50 years back. Believe it or not, the leadership literature is not advanced as much as you might hope. The big movement has been to something called leader-member exchange. And even that just doesn't seem to hold up in the research. And that's what this exchange feature is, the need to engage with employees and actually have an ongoing dialogue. And they do know that that's absolutely essential. But again, the research since the 70s has been less than stellar. Hard to believe we did better then than we are doing now. So what are some of the leadership myths that you should avoid? Well, first, that it's innate, that people are born to it. One of the things that happens is we put people in leadership positions and they immediately rewrite their life stories and tell you that, oh, I was destined for this, when as often as not, it was just pure chance. So do not buy into that myth. This idea that it's rare or innate, no, it is not. We can all be leaders in our time. And again, we talked earlier at the outset of this about what was happening with George Floyd, and you're seeing leaders come out of the woodwork who have ideas